The rain hammered against the windows of the Century Plaza Hotel in downtown, Los Angeles with such force that it sounded like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping urgently against the glass, demanding to be let in. Inside room 714, Sarah Martinez sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed, her hands trembling as she held her phone, reading the same text message over and over again until the words blurred together. "We're going in a different direction with the franchise. Character will be written out after this film. Sorry it had to end this way. 20 years of her life, 20 years of being the face that millions of people recognized, 20 years of sacrificing friendships and relationships and normalcy, and it was ending with a text message that took someone probably 30 seconds to type. She felt hollow, like someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out everything that made her feel alive, leaving behind only the shell of someone who used to matter. She had come to this hotel because she couldn't bear to be in her own home, that massive mansion in the hills that suddenly felt like a museum dedicated to a version of herself she no longer recognized. Every award on the shelf, every magazine cover framed on the wall, every photograph from premieres and parties felt like evidence from someone else's life. When you spend 2 decades building your entire identity around being someone that other people want to watch, what happens when they decide they don't want to watch anymore? The question sat in her mind like a weight, pressing down on everything else until it was the only thought she could hold. She was 42 years old, and for the first time since she was 22, she had no idea who she was supposed to be. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had chosen this particular hotel, this particular floor, this particular hallway. 3 doors down, in room 717, was someone she hadn't seen in person for almost 15 years, not since they wrapped filming on that small independent movie that nobody saw, but that she still considered one of the best experiences of her career. David Chen wasn't like the other actors she had worked with over the years. While everyone else was networking and politicking and constantly performing even when the cameras weren't rolling, David had simply done the work, treated every single person on set with genuine kindness, and then disappeared into his life away from the spotlight. He had walked away from Hollywood at the height of his career, choosing instead to spend his time running a foundation that built schools in underserved communities, and the industry had never quite forgiven him for it. You weren't supposed to walk away from success. You weren't supposed to choose obscurity over fame. You weren't supposed to suggest, through your actions, that maybe all of this wasn't actually the most important thing in the world. Sarah had kept loose tabs on him over the years through mutual friends and occasional internet searches that she would never admit to anyone. She knew he still did small projects sometimes, independent films that paid almost nothing, but that he connected with, documentaries about issues he cared about, voice work for animated films that supported causes close to his heart. She knew he had never married, never had children, lived a quiet life that seemed to be built around being useful rather than being seen. When she found out through her assistant that he was staying at this hotel for a few days while meeting with potential donors for his foundation, she had impulsively booked a room on the same floor, telling herself she just wanted to be near someone who had successfully figured out how to exist in a way that didn't require constant validation from strangers. She hadn't planned to actually talk to him. She hadn't planned to knock on his door. She hadn't planned any of this. But now, sitting in this anonymous hotel room with rain creating rivers down the windows and her career crumbling around her like old newspaper, she felt a desperate pull toward the person 3 doors down who had somehow found a way to matter without needing to be famous. Her therapist would probably call this a moment of crisis, a breaking point where old patterns either reassert themselves or finally shatter completely. A publicist would tell her to post something inspiring on social media, to control the narrative, to remind people why they should still care about her. Her mother would tell her to pull herself together and remember how lucky she was to have had 20 years when most actors never get 20 days. But none of those voices felt true right now. The only thing that felt true was this overwhelming need to talk to someone who had chosen a different path and survived. She stood up before she could talk herself out of it, catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror across from the bed. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had been crying, who hadn't slept properly in days, who was wearing yoga pants and an old college sweatshirt because she couldn't bring herself to care about appearing put together. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many nights spent wondering when everything had started to feel so empty. This was not how Sarah Martinez appeared in public. This was not the version of herself that posed for photographers or smiled through interviews or pretended that everything was always fine. This was just Sarah, raw and tired and desperately searching for something she couldn't quite name. The hallway was empty and quiet except for the muffled sound of a television coming from one of the other rooms and the distant ding of the elevator. Sarah walked slowly toward room 717, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. What was she even going to say? "Hi, we worked together 15 years ago, and you probably barely remember me, but I'm having an existential crisis. And you're the only person I could think of who might understand what it feels like to walk away from everything you thought defined you." That sounded insane. That sounded like something that would end with hotel security escorting her back to her room and David Chen getting a restraining order. But her hand was already rising, already forming a fist, already knocking on the door before her rational mind could intervene. For a long moment, nothing happened. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with crushing disappointment, already turning to walk back to her room, already composing the story she would tell herself about this moment of temporary insanity. But then she heard footsteps, and the door opened, and there he was. David Chen looked almost exactly the same as he had 15 years ago, maybe a bit more gray in his hair, maybe a few more lines around his eyes, but with that same quality of presence that had always set him apart. He wasn't handsome in the conventional movie star way, but there was something in his face that made you want to keep looking, a gentleness combined with an intensity that suggested he was actually paying attention to what was happening around him. He was wearing jeans and a plain black shirt, and he had reading glasses pushed up on top of his head, and for a moment he just looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was quiet but certain, and she realized that he had recognized her immediately despite her tear-stained face and complete lack of glamour. "Are you okay?" Those 3 words, delivered with such simple, genuine concern, broke something open inside her that she had been holding closed for longer than she could remember. She felt tears spring to her eyes again, felt her throat close up, felt every defense she had carefully constructed over 20 years of public life crumble into dust. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak, and David stepped back from the door without hesitation, gesturing her inside with a small movement of his hand that somehow conveyed both invitation and understanding. His room was almost identical to hers, but somehow felt completely different, probably because he had actually unpacked and made it into a temporary space rather than just a place to hide. There were books stacked on the desk, a laptop open with what looked like architectural plans on the screen, a half-eaten sandwich on a plate, a jacket draped over the chair. Evidence of a life being lived rather than a life being paused. David closed the door quietly and moved to the small sitting area by the window, settling into one of the chairs and indicating that she should take the other. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't make small talk. He just waited, giving her space to gather herself, and something about that patience made it easier to breathe. "I don't really know why I'm here," Sarah finally managed to say, her voice rough and uncertain. "We haven't talked in 15 years and I just showed up at your door like a crazy person, and you probably have work to do and I should go." She started to stand, but David shook his head slightly, and she found herself sinking back into the chair. "You're here because you needed to be somewhere other than where you were," he said simply. "And because sometimes the only people who can understand certain things are the people who have gone through similar things, even if the details are different." He paused, studying her face with that characteristic attention. "I heard about the franchise decision. I'm sorry. I know that must feel like the end of something important." Sarah let out a laugh that was half sob. "How did you hear about that? It literally just happened a few hours ago." David smiled slightly. "I still have friends in the industry and they still gossip. News travels fast, especially when it's about someone people care about." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression serious. "But I'm guessing that's not really what this is about, is it? Franchise ending is the thing that happened, but it's not the thing that's actually breaking your heart right now." His insight cut through all her defenses, and Sarah felt something in her chest crack wide open. "I don't know who I am without all of this," she whispered. "I've spent 20 years being the person they needed me to be, playing the part they wanted me to play both on screen and off, and somewhere along the way I completely lost track of what I actually want or what actually matters to me. And now they don't want me anymore, and I feel like I'm disappearing, like I never actually existed in the first place." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable, and more honest than anything she had said to anyone in years. David didn't immediately try to fix it or minimize it or offer empty reassurance. He just sat with it for a moment, honoring the weight of what she was feeling. "I remember the first time I realized that fame was making me less of a person instead of more," he finally said. "I was at some party, surrounded by people who all wanted something from me, and I caught my own reflection in a window and didn't recognize the person looking back. I had this moment of clarity where I understood that if I kept going down that path, I would eventually become nothing but a collection of other people's expectations and desires, and the actual me would just cease to exist." He took off his glasses and set them on the table between them. That's when I knew I had to walk away, at least from that version of success. It was the hardest and best decision I ever made. But how did you do it? Sarah asked, leaning forward urgently. How did you figure out who you were supposed to be instead? How did you build a life that felt real? David was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him considering how to answer, searching for words that would actually be useful rather than just comforting. I started by admitting that I didn't know, he said slowly. I had spent so long pretending to have all the answers, pretending to be confident and certain, that it was actually terrifying to say out loud that I was completely lost. But once I admitted that, once I stopped performing certainty, I could start actually looking for what mattered to me. And I found that the things that made me feel most alive had nothing to do with being seen or celebrated. They had to do with being useful, with connecting to people in real ways, with building things that would outlast my reputation. They talked for hours as the rain continued to fall outside, and the sky darkened from gray afternoon to black night. David told her about the early days of his foundation, how terrifying it had been to try to make a difference without the cushion of fame to fall back on, how many times he had failed before figuring out what actually worked. Sarah told him about the slow erosion of her sense of self, how she had started making every decision based on what would be best for her career rather than what would be best for her soul, how she had looked up one day and realized she had been so busy being successful that she had forgotten to be happy. There was something deeply cathartic about speaking these truths to someone who didn't need her to be anyone other than exactly who she was in that moment. At some point, David ordered room service, and they ate pasta and salad sitting on the floor with plates balanced on their knees like college students rather than accomplished adults in their 40s. At some point, Sarah kicked off her shoes and curled her legs underneath her, feeling more relaxed than she had in months. At some point, she realized that this conversation, this unexpected connection, was already changing something fundamental in how she saw her situation. The ending of her franchise no longer felt like the end of everything. It felt like a door closing so that other doors could open, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small flicker of curiosity about what might be on the other side of those doors. I have a question, David said as they were finishing their food, and there was a carefulness in his tone that made Sarah look up. Why did you really come to this hotel? Why my floor, my hallway? You could have hidden anywhere in the world. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, embarrassed to admit how much intention had been behind what she had tried to frame as coincidence. I needed to be near someone who had survived walking away, she said quietly. I needed proof that it was possible to matter without being famous, to have a life that felt full without the applause. And you were the only person I could think of who had actually done it. She met his eyes. I know that probably sounds pathetic. David shook his head firmly. It sounds human. It sounds like someone who is brave enough to admit they need help, which is actually one of the hardest things to do. He hesitated, and Sarah could see him weighing whether to say what he was thinking. I should tell you something. It wasn't entirely coincidence that I was at this hotel this week. Now it was his turn to look embarrassed. I knew you were filming nearby. I heard through the same gossiping friends that you were having a hard time. And I chose to take meetings in this city at this hotel because some part of me hoped our paths might cross. Because 15 years ago, working with you on that little movie that nobody saw, I saw someone who was genuinely kind and genuinely talented and genuinely struggling with the weight of fame, and I always wondered if you had found a way to reconcile those things. He smiled slightly. So if you showing up at my door makes you pathetic, then I guess we're both pathetic together. The confession shifted something in the room, adding a layer of meaning to the evening that Sarah hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just a chance encounter or a desperate woman seeking wisdom from a former colleague. This was two people who had been circling each other in thought for 15 years, finally ending up in the same space at the exact moment when that meeting could actually matter. Sarah felt her heart beat faster, felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the food or the wine they had shared. What happens now? She asked softly, and she wasn't entirely sure if she was asking about her career or about whatever was developing between them in this hotel room while rain fell outside. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of the city blurred by water and weather. I think you're standing at a crossroads, he said without turning around. You can fight to get back what you're losing, spend your energy trying to convince people to still want you in the way they used to want you. Or you can take this as an opportunity to reinvent everything, to build a life based on what you actually value rather than what you think you're supposed to value. He turned to face her, and there was an intensity in his expression that made her breath catch. But I should tell you that if you choose the second path, it's going to be harder than anything you've ever done. It's going to require you to let go of every security you've built, every identity you've crafted. It's going to mean being nobody for a while so that you can figure out who you actually want to be. Before Sarah could respond, before she could process the weight of what he was offering, David's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and his expression changed completely, all the color draining from his face. "No," he whispered, and there was such devastation in that single word that Sarah stood immediately, moving toward him. "What is it? What's wrong?" David looked at her with eyes that had gone dark with shock and grief. "There's been an accident," he said, his voice shaking. "The school we just finished building in Guatemala, the one that was supposed to open next week. There was a structural failure. The building collapsed." He gripped the phone so hard his knuckles went white. "3 of my team members were inside doing final preparations. They're trapped in the rubble." The next few hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. The kind where you're running as fast as you can, but your legs feel like they're moving through water, and you can never quite reach the thing you're desperately trying to reach. David stood in the center of his hotel room with his phone pressed to his ear, making call after call in a voice that remained steady through sheer force of, well, while his hands shook so badly he could barely dial. Sarah watched him transform from the contemplative, gentle person she had been talking with all evening into someone operating in pure crisis mode. Every ounce of his energy focused on gathering information and coordinating response. She felt completely useless, standing there in her yoga pants with pasta sauce probably still on her shirt, bearing witness to the collapse of something that clearly mattered more to him than anything else in the world. "How long ago did it happen?" David was asking, his jaw tight. "Do we have people on site? Has anyone contacted the families yet? What is the hospital situation in the nearest town?" He listened, nodding even though the person on the other end couldn't see him, his free hand running through his hair over and over in the only outward sign of his internal panic. Okay. I need you to charter a plane immediately. I don't care what it costs. I need to be there as soon as physically possible." Another pause. "No, I understand that, but I'm not going to sit in Los Angeles while my people are trapped under a building that I built. That's not happening." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, revealing the tremendous weight of guilt and responsibility he was carrying. When he finally hung up, he stood motionless for a moment with his eyes closed, and Sarah could see him trying to gather himself, trying to find the strength to keep moving forward. "The collapse happened about 4 hours ago," he said quietly without opening his eyes. "They've got local emergency services on site, but the town is small, and they don't have the equipment or expertise for this kind of rescue. My operations director is trying to get specialized teams mobilized from Guatemala City, but it's going to take time. Time that Maria and James and Carlos might not have." He opened his eyes and looked at Sarah, and she saw in his face a depth of pain that made her own career troubles feel embarrassingly trivial. "I designed that building. I approved those plans. If the structure failed, if something was wrong with the engineering, then this is my fault. Those people are trapped because of me." Sarah crossed the room without thinking, placing her hand on his arm. "You don't know that yet. You don't know what caused the collapse. It could have been any number of things that had nothing to do with your design." But David shook his head sharply. "It doesn't matter what caused it. They were there because of me, because I convinced them to dedicate their lives to this work, because I promised them we were making a difference. And now they're buried under concrete and steel, and I'm standing in a hotel room 7 countries away completely powerless to help them." The anguish in his voice was almost unbearable to hear. "Then let's not be powerless," Sarah said with a firmness that surprised both of them. "What do you need? What can I do to help?" David looked at her as if he had forgotten she was there, his mind so consumed by the crisis that everything else had faded to background noise. "There's nothing you can do. This isn't your responsibility. You should go back to your room, get some sleep. I'm sorry our evening ended this way." He was already turning back to his laptop, already pulling up airline schedules and charter services, already trying to figure out the fastest route from Los Angeles to a small town in the Guatemalan highlands. But Sarah didn't move. She thought about the conversation they had been having before the phone call, about purpose and meaning and building a life based on being useful rather than being seen. She thought about how empty her own crisis had felt compared to this real emergency with real lives at stake. She thought about the fact that she had spent 20 years developing skills in managing media and mobilizing resources and navigating complex logistics, and that maybe those skills could actually matter right now in a way they had never mattered during any of her film productions. "David," she said firmly, waiting until he looked at her again, "I have access to resources that you probably don't. I have connections to people who can make things happen quickly. Let me help, please." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of solitary responsibility he had been wearing. "You would do that? You would get involved in this?" Sarah nodded. "Tell me what you need." David was silent for a moment, and she could practically see him running through calculations in his mind, weighing his instinct to handle everything himself against the practical reality that he needed all the help he could get. "We need to get a specialized rescue team to the site as fast as possible." We need medical supplies and equipment. We need someone managing communications with the families so they're not getting conflicting information. And we need to keep this out of the media until we know more, because the last thing those families need is reporters showing up asking for quotes about their grief. Sarah pulled out her phone and started scrolling through contacts. I know someone who runs a private aviation company. He owes me a favor from when I helped with publicity for his charity event last year. I can probably get us access to a plane that can land in Guatemala City within the next few hours. She looked up at David. Us, I'm coming with you. You're not doing this alone. David started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. I know I don't know anything about construction or rescue operations, but I know how to coordinate people and manage logistics and keep things organized when everything is chaos. That's basically what film production is. So you can either waste time arguing with me, or you can accept the help and let's get moving. For the first time since the phone call, something like gratitude flickered across David's face. Okay, he said simply. Thank you. And just like that, they were a team, two people who had been virtual strangers a few hours ago now working together with perfect synchronization toward a common urgent goal. Sarah made calls while David packed, her voice shifting into the crisp professional tone she used when she needed people to take her seriously and move quickly. She explained to her aviation contact that she needed a plane immediately for a humanitarian emergency. And yes, she understood it was the middle of the night. And yes, she would personally cover whatever premium rates were necessary to make it happen right now. She called her assistant and woke him up and asked him to pull together information on rescue organizations that operated in Central America. She even called her publicist and gave strict instructions that if any media inquiries came in about her whereabouts over the next few days, the response was simply that she was dealing with a private matter and would have no comment. Within 90 minutes, they had a plane ready to depart from a private airfield. A rescue team from an organization based in Mexico City that specialized in earthquake response mobilizing to meet them in Guatemala, and a communications plan for keeping the families informed without letting the situation turn into a media circus. Sarah had gone back to her room just long enough to throw clothes into a bag and change into jeans and boots, pulling her hair into a practical braid and grabbing her passport from the room safe. When she met David in the hallway, he looked at her with an expression that held both worry and something else, something warmer that she didn't have time to examine right now. The drive to the airfield was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts while the driver navigated through late-night Los Angeles traffic. Sarah found herself thinking about how strange it was that 12 hours ago her biggest problem had been the end of a film franchise, and now she was on her way to Guatemala to help with a rescue operation for people she had never met. The shift in perspective was so dramatic it was almost disorienting, but it also felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate. For the first time in years, she was doing something that had nothing to do with her image or her career, and everything to do with simply helping because help was needed. There was a clarity to that, a simplicity that cut through all the complicated noise of her regular life. On the plane, a small jet configured with comfortable seats and a work table. They spread out maps and building plans while the pilots ran through pre-flight checks. David walked her through the school project, explaining how it had been designed to serve 3 rural communities that had never had access to education beyond elementary level, how the building had been engineered to withstand earthquakes and tropical storms, how every detail had been carefully considered to make sure it would serve the community for generations. His voice was steady as he explained the technical aspects, but Sarah could hear the emotion underneath, the weight of love and hope that he had poured into this project. This was going to be our flagship, he said quietly, pointing to a photograph of the nearly completed building. Proof that our model could work, that we could scale up and do this in dozens of other communities. And now we're going to get your people out safely and figure out what happened and decide what comes next, Sarah finished firmly. One step at a time, David. We can't solve everything right now, so we focus on what we can actually do in this moment. He looked at her with an expression of mild surprise. When did you become the voice of practical wisdom? Sarah laughed without much humor. About 2 hours ago, when I realized that my problems are really not that serious in the grand scheme of things. Perspective is a hell of a drug. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it once. We're going to get through this, all of us together. The flight to Guatemala City took just over 4 hours, and neither of them slept despite the exhaustion that was starting to settle into Sarah's bones. Instead, they worked, making calls to coordinate the arrival of the rescue team, reviewing structural plans to understand what they might be dealing with, reaching out to contacts at the US Embassy to make sure they would have whatever governmental support they needed. David seemed to gain strength from having concrete tasks to focus on, his mind shifting into problem-solving mode and away from the spiral of guilt and fear. Sarah found herself falling into a rhythm with him, anticipating what he would need before he asked for it, offering suggestions when he got stuck, providing a steady presence that allowed him to think clearly. They were somewhere over Mexico when David finally leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, though Sarah could tell he wasn't sleeping, just trying to find a moment of stillness before the chaos that awaited them. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly, not sure if he would want to talk. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Earlier tonight, before all this happened, you were telling me about walking away from fame and building a different kind of life. Did you ever regret it? Were there moments when you wished you had just stayed on the conventional path?" David considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "There were definitely moments when it felt easier to be famous," he admitted. "Fame gives you a kind of power and access that can be useful, and there were definitely times when I missed the creative work, the actual craft of acting, but regret? No. Because even on the hardest days doing this work, I knew that it mattered in a way that nothing I did as an actor ever mattered. When a kid from one of our schools gets to go to university, when a community gains access to opportunities they never had before, that impact is real and lasting in a way that entertainment can never be. But now that impact has led to people being hurt," Sarah said carefully, trying to understand his thinking. "Does that change the equation for you?" David was quiet for a long moment. "It makes me question my competence. It makes me wonder if I'm actually qualified to be doing this work or if I'm just a dilettante playing at humanitarianism. But it doesn't make me question whether the work itself matters. Those questions are different." He rubbed his face tiredly. "I think the thing that haunts me most is the possibility that my ego was involved in this. That maybe I pushed for a bigger, more ambitious building than we were ready for because I wanted to prove something. If people are hurt because I was trying to make a statement rather than just serving the need, I don't know how I live with that." Sarah felt a surge of compassion for the weight he was carrying. "From everything you've told me about this project, it sounds like every decision was made thoughtfully with the community's needs at the center. You can't know yet what caused the collapse. You're torturing yourself with hypotheticals when what you need to do is wait for actual information." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And honestly, even if mistakes were made, even if something in the design or construction wasn't right, that doesn't erase all the good you've done. It means you're human. It means you'll learn and do better next time. But it doesn't mean you should stop trying to make a difference." They landed in Guatemala City just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that felt almost offensively beautiful given the circumstances. A driver was waiting to take them to the site, a 3-hour journey into the highlands over increasingly rough roads. David sat tensely in the passenger seat, checking his phone constantly for updates, his leg bouncing with nervous energy. The rescue team they had arranged for was already on site, and the early reports suggested that there were signs of life in the rubble, sounds of movement and voices. But accessing the trapped workers was proving difficult because of the instability of the remaining structure. Sarah watched the landscape change as they climbed into the mountains, lush vegetation giving way to rocky terrain dotted with small villages. She thought about all the times she had traveled for film productions, staying in luxury hotels and eating catered meals, and being constantly attended to by assistants and handlers. This was so completely different. They stopped once for gas, and she used the bathroom at a tiny station where the facilities were basic and the water ran cold, and she found herself almost laughing at how far she was from her normal life. The woman who couldn't leave her house without perfect makeup and designer clothes was gone. In her place was someone who could focus on what actually mattered rather than how things appeared. When they finally reached the site, Sarah's breath caught at the scope of the devastation. What had been a beautiful modern building in the photographs David had shown her was now a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete, with sections of wall standing at odd angles like broken teeth. Emergency vehicles were parked haphazardly around the perimeter, and people in safety gear moved purposefully through the rubble. David was out of the car before it fully stopped, striding toward a group of people who were clearly coordinating the rescue effort. Sarah followed, hanging back slightly to let him take the lead but ready to help however she could. A woman in a hard hat spotted David and rushed over, and Sarah could see the relief in her face at his arrival. "David, thank God. We've made voice contact with all 3 of them. They're alive, but Maria has a leg injury and James is having trouble breathing. We think there's a pocket of space about 12 feet down, but the main support beam is compromised, and we're worried that trying to drill through could trigger another collapse." She thrust a tablet at him showing what Sarah assumed was some kind of ground-penetrating radar image. "The engineers think the safest approach is to shore up this section first and then excavate from the side. But that's going to take at least another 6 hours, and I don't know if they have that long. Sarah watched David study the images, watched him ask technical questions about load bearing and structural integrity, watched him transition fully into leadership mode despite the fear she knew he was feeling. He was completely in his element here, and she could see why people followed him, why they believed in his vision. After several minutes of intense discussion, he made a decision about the approach they would take, balancing speed against safety, and the team immediately moved to implement the plan. David turned to find Sarah standing a few feet away, and something in his expression softened when he saw her. "You should probably wait somewhere away from the site," he said. "This is going to be dangerous, and there's no reason for you to be at risk." But Sarah shook her head. "I didn't come all this way to hide in the car. What do you need me to do?" The woman in the hard hat looked between them with curiosity. "Who is this, David?" He hesitated, and Sarah could see him trying to figure out how to explain her presence. "This is Sarah Martinez. She's a friend who helped me get here quickly and who is going to help coordinate communications." He glanced at Sarah. "If you really want to help, the families of the trapped workers are in that building over there. They've been here all night and they're terrified, and they need someone to keep them informed about what's happening in a way they can understand. Can you do that?" It was perhaps the most important role Sarah had ever been asked to play, and it had nothing to do with memorizing lines or hitting marks. She nodded. "I can do that." David squeezed her shoulder once, a quick gesture of gratitude, and then he was gone, moving toward the rescue operation with focused intensity. Sarah took a deep breath, finger-combed her hair which was already escaping from its braid in the humid heat, and walked toward the small concrete building where the families waited. This was so far outside her comfort zone that she couldn't even see her comfort zone from here, but somehow that made it easier. She wasn't Sarah Martinez the actress. She was just Sarah, a person trying to help other people get through the worst day of their lives. The building turned out to be a community center, and inside she found about 15 people ranging from elderly parents to young children, all with the same expression of exhausted worry. A local woman who introduced herself as Carmen and spoke excellent English had been acting as liaison, and she looked almost as relieved to see Sarah as the rescue coordinator had looked to see David. "Are you with David Chen's foundation?" Carmen asked, and Sarah nodded, not bothering to explain the complexity of her actual relationship to all of this. "What's happening out there? They haven't told us anything in over an hour, and people are starting to imagine the worst." Sarah gathered the families into a circle, and drawing on every skill she had developed from 20 years of public speaking and interviews, began to carefully explain what the rescue team was doing and why each step was necessary. She didn't sugarcoat the danger, but she also didn't dramatize it. She was honest about the challenges while emphasizing that experienced professionals were doing everything possible to bring their loved ones out safely. She answered every question as thoroughly as she could, and when she didn't know the answer, she promised to find out. She held hands with Maria's mother, who was crying silently, and she sat on the floor with Carlos's young daughter and distracted her with stories about the movies she had made, carefully editing out anything scary or sad. Hours passed in that small room with its concrete floor and harsh fluorescent lighting. Sarah made trips back and forth to the rescue site, getting updates from David or the rescue coordinator and bringing them back to the families. She organized food when someone from a local restaurant brought donations. She helped Carmen translate when the English wasn't quite connecting. She did 1,000 small things that individually meant nothing but collectively meant that these frightened people felt less alone. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, covered in dust and sweat with her expensive jeans probably ruined and her manicure destroyed, Sarah realized that she felt more purposeful and more fully herself than she had felt in years. It was late afternoon, nearly 24 hours since the collapse, when a shout went up from the rescue site. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat as she ran outside with the families behind her, terrified of what the commotion might mean. But then she saw the rescue workers emerging from the rubble, and they were helping someone out, a man covered in dust and blood but moving under his own power. James. He was alive. The families erupted in tears and prayers, clutching each other as they watched the first survivor being loaded into an ambulance. Sarah found herself crying too, overwhelmed by relief and the sheer human drama of the moment. Within the next hour, Carlos was also extracted, dehydrated and bruised but conscious and asking immediately about his daughter. Sarah was the one who got to tell his little girl that her father was safe, and the joy on that child's face was worth more than every award Sarah had ever won. But Maria was still trapped, and as the sun started to set, the rescue team was racing against fading light and increasing structural instability. David looked like he had aged 10 years in one day, his face drawn with exhaustion and stress as he consulted with engineers about how to safely reach the last trapped worker. Sarah stood beside him as they worked, not saying anything because there was nothing to say, just being a steady presence. "There's a complication," the chief engineer finally said, and Sarah felt David stiffen beside her. "The space where Maria is trapped is filling with water from a broken pipe. If we don't get her out in the next 2 hours, she could drown." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The safest approach they had been taking was too slow. They needed to take a risk, to move faster. But moving faster meant potentially triggering another collapse that could kill both Maria and the rescuers trying to save her. David looked at the structural analysis, looked at the rescue team, looked at the sky that was darkening toward night. Sarah could practically see the weight of the decision crushing him. "What do you think?" he asked the engineer quietly. "If it was your family member down there, what would you do?" The engineer was silent for a long moment. "I'd shore up sections B and C, then drill directly down and pray the remaining structure holds long enough to get her out. But I'd be praying hard because it's maybe a 60% chance of success." 60%. Not good odds when a life hung in the balance. David closed his eyes, and Sarah knew he was thinking about every decision that had led to this moment, carrying the weight of leadership that meant his choices determined whether people lived or died. "Do it," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shore it up and drill down. We're not letting her drown." The rescue team moved immediately, and Sarah slipped her hand into David's as they watched the operation unfold. She could feel him trembling slightly, could feel the terror and determination running through him in equal measure. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "you made the right call. You're giving her the best chance she has." David didn't respond, but his hand gripped hers tighter, and they stood together as the drill started and the light faded and everything came down to chance and skill and hope. The sound of the drill biting into concrete was deafening, a mechanical scream that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains and fill the entire valley. Sarah stood with David behind the safety line, both of them wearing hard hats that someone had thrust at them, both of them unable to look away from the operation unfolding in the rapidly fading light. Portable spotlights had been set up around the site, creating harsh shadows that made the whole scene feel even more dramatic and unreal. Sarah kept thinking that this felt like something from one of her action movies, except in those carefully choreographed sequences, she had always known that everyone would be fine, that the stunt coordinators had planned for every contingency, that the danger was all carefully controlled illusion. Here, the danger was brutally real. Every few minutes the drilling would stop, and the team would call down into the hole they were creating, trying to maintain contact with Maria, making sure she was still conscious and responsive. Each time there was a long, terrible pause before they would hear her voice calling back up, weak but present, and each time Sarah felt David's entire body relax slightly with relief before tensing again as the drilling resumed. The chief engineer was monitoring a dozen different sensors, watching for any sign that the remaining structure was shifting or that their intervention was making things worse. Twice he called for a halt while they adjusted the shoring, adding additional supports to reduce the risk of collapse. Time stretched out strangely, each minute feeling like an hour, the whole operation existing in a space outside normal reality. Maria's mother stood with the other families behind a second safety line, her hands clasped in prayer, her lips moving silently with words Sarah couldn't hear but could feel the intention behind. Carmen stood beside her with an arm around her shoulders, and several other community members had joined them, a whole group of people holding vigil as the rescue continued. Sarah thought about what David had said earlier about impact, about doing work that mattered. Whatever happened with his career or his foundation after this, these people would remember that he had shown up, that he had stood with them through the crisis, that he had made the hard calls and taken responsibility. That kind of witness, that kind of solidarity, was worth something that couldn't be measured in conventional success metrics. The shout from the rescue team sent a jolt through everyone watching. "We have visual contact." David moved forward instinctively, but the engineer held up a hand, stopping him before he crossed the safety line. "Let them work," the man said firmly but not unkindly. "The next part is delicate and we can't have anyone in the way." So David stopped, frozen in place, every muscle in his body radiating the desire to do something, to help, to not be relegated to helpless observer. Sarah moved to stand directly beside him, her shoulder touching his, trying to communicate through that small point of contact that he wasn't alone in this helplessness. The rescue team worked with impressive efficiency, lowering a harness down into the hole they had created, calling instructions to Maria about how to secure it around herself. Sarah could hear the strain in the voices of the rescuers, could see the tension in their movements as they worked against time and unstable structure. The water that had been filling Maria's space had slowed but not stopped, and everyone knew that they were in a race against multiple different clocks, any one of which could run out and turn this rescue into a recovery operation. The thought was unbearable, and Sarah pushed it away, choosing to focus on the small positive details, the fact that Maria was conscious enough to follow instructions, the fact that the structure had held this long, the fact that the drill hadn't triggered the collapse everyone feared. "We've got her secured," came the call from below. "Beginning extraction now." This was the moment of greatest danger, when pulling Maria up through the hole might shift the rubble in unpredictable ways. The engineer stared at his monitors with absolute focus, and Sarah noticed that he had one hand hovering over what she assumed was an emergency stop button, ready to abort if any sensor showed critical movement. The winch began to turn with a mechanical whine, slowly pulling the harness up inch by careful inch. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Sarah realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to breathe normally. David had gone completely still beside her, not even seeming to blink as he watched. And then, like something from a miracle, a hand appeared at the top of the hole, then an arm, then a helmet with a dust-covered face beneath it. The rescue workers grabbed Maria carefully, supporting her weight as they lifted her clear of the opening, and immediately began moving her away from the unstable structure toward the waiting ambulance. She was conscious. Sarah could see her eyes open and moving, tracking the people around her, and the relief that washed through the watching crowd was almost palpable, a collective exhale after hours of held breath. Maria's mother broke through the safety line and ran toward her daughter, and no one tried to stop her, the rules suspended in the face of a mother's need to touch her child and confirm that she was real and alive. David made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob, his knees actually buckling slightly before he caught himself. Sarah wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting him, and he leaned into her for just a moment before straightening and moving toward the ambulance where the medics were doing their assessment. Sarah followed, staying back far enough to give the medical team room to work, but close enough to hear what they were saying. Maria had a badly broken leg, several cracked ribs, significant dehydration, and probable internal bruising, but nothing immediately life-threatening. She would need surgery on the leg and extended recovery time, but she was going to be okay. All 3 trapped workers had survived. Against odds that hadn't been particularly good, everyone had made it out alive. The families surrounded the ambulances, tears and prayers and gratitude flowing freely in a mixture of Spanish and English and emotion that transcended language. David stood slightly apart, and Sarah could see him struggling to process everything, the relief and the residual terror and the guilt that clearly hadn't abated just because the rescue had been successful. She moved to his side and he looked at her with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "They're okay," he said, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "They're all okay," Sarah nodded. "They're okay because you got resources mobilized quickly, because you made the right calls, because you brought in people who knew what they were doing. You did this, David." But he shook his head. "I also built the building that collapsed on them in the first place. We still don't know why the structure failed. We still don't know if it was something I could have prevented." Before Sarah could respond, the chief engineer approached them, removing his hard hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to give you a preliminary assessment. We won't know for certain until we do a full investigation, but based on what we could see of the collapse pattern, this looks like it was caused by subsurface ground movement, probably related to that small earthquake we had in the region last week. The tremor was only a 3.2, so nobody paid much attention to it. But in an area with unstable soil composition, it could have created a void beneath part of the foundation." David stared at him. "So this wasn't a structural design failure. It wasn't something wrong with how the building was engineered." The engineer shook his head. "The building actually performed remarkably well considering the circumstances. If it had been purely a design or construction flaw, the entire structure would have come down. Instead, only one section collapsed, and it collapsed in a way that created survivable spaces, which suggests your engineering was sound. You can't design against every possible environmental variable, especially when you're working in geologically complex terrain. Sometimes bad things happen despite everyone doing everything right." The words seemed to crack something open in David, and he actually sat down right there on the dusty ground, dropping his head into his hands. Sarah sat beside him, not touching him now, just being present while he processed the complicated tangle of relief and residual trauma and gradual release of the crushing guilt he had been carrying. The engineer excused himself tactfully, and for several minutes they just sat there while around them the organized chaos of the rescue began to wind down. Finally, David lifted his head and looked at Sarah with an expression of such raw vulnerability that she felt her heart constrict. "I thought I had killed them," he said quietly. "I really thought my arrogance or my incompetence had killed 3 people who trusted me." "But it didn't," Sarah said firmly. "And now you get to learn from this experience and build even better systems for geological assessment and monitoring. You get to take what was almost a tragedy and turn it into knowledge that makes all your future projects safer." She paused. That's what resilience is, right? Not avoiding failure or tragedy altogether, but learning how to move through it and grow from it. David looked at her for a long moment. When did you get so wise? Sarah laughed. About 24 hours ago, when I showed up at your hotel room having a breakdown about my canceled franchise, and you helped me see that maybe my whole life needed to be canceled and rebuilt from a better foundation. I'm just returning the favor. They sat together watching the sun fully set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep blue, and Sarah felt something shift inside her, a sense of clarity about what came next in her own life. She thought about the woman she had been just yesterday, so consumed with anxiety about her fading fame that she couldn't see past it to anything else. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. A woman sitting in the dirt in Guatemala wearing ruined designer jeans and feeling more purposeful than she had in years. This felt like someone she could actually recognize and respect. The crisis wasn't over, not really. There would be investigations and decisions about whether to rebuild and difficult conversations with the communities who had been counting on this school. But the immediate emergency had passed, and they had space now to breathe and think. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and David stayed in the area, working with the foundation team to manage the aftermath of the collapse. They visited the 3 rescued workers in the hospital, listening to their stories of the hours trapped in the rubble, bearing witness to their trauma and their remarkable resilience. They met with community leaders to talk about next steps and to reassure them that the foundation wasn't abandoning the project. They coordinated with structural engineers who arrived to do a comprehensive investigation of the site. Sarah found herself naturally sliding into a role managing communications and logistics, using skills she had developed in the entertainment industry in service of something that felt infinitely more important. In the evenings, after long, exhausting days of difficult conversations and complex problem-solving, Sarah and David would find themselves sitting together on the porch of the small guest house where they were staying, talking about everything and nothing while the sounds of the mountain night surrounded them. They talked about their childhoods and their fears and their hopes for who they might become in the second halves of their lives. They talked about the nature of success and whether fame had any inherent value or was just a distraction from more meaningful measures of a life well lived. They talked about the school that had collapsed and whether it made sense to rebuild on the same site or to rethink the entire approach. I keep coming back to what you said that first night, David told her during one of these evening conversations, about how you had lost track of who you were because you spent so long being who everyone else needed you to be. I think I did something similar, just in a different direction. I walked away from acting because I was trying to prove that I was more than just another shallow celebrity, and somewhere in that I might have made my humanitarian work too much about my own identity. Like I needed to be the guy who gave it all up for the greater good, and that need might have made me push too hard, take on more than I was ready for. Sarah considered this. So what would it look like to do the work without it being about proving something about yourself? David smiled slightly. I have no idea, but I think it starts with being okay with being smaller, with doing less but doing it better, with building slower and more carefully even if it's not as impressive to potential donors. He looked at her. What about you? What does the next chapter look like now that you've had some distance from your crisis? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night insects and the distant sound of music from the village below. I think I need to step away from the kind of acting I've been doing, the franchises and the blockbusters and the constant pressure to maintain a certain level of fame. Maybe I do smaller projects, independent films like the one we did together all those years ago. Maybe I use whatever platform I still have to support work like yours. Maybe I finally take that pottery class I've been thinking about for 10 years and accept that I'm allowed to do things just because they bring me joy rather than because they advance my career. Pottery, David said with amusement. That's very specific, Sarah laughed. I know it sounds random, but there's something about working with clay, creating something with your hands that's functional and beautiful but also temporary and fragile, that appeals to me right now. Everything in my life has been about creating this permanent brand, this unchanging image, and I'm tired of it. I want to make things that can break, that can be reshaped, that don't have to last forever to have value. She turned to look at him in the dim light from the single bulb illuminating the porch. Does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense, David said quietly. It sounds like you're giving yourself permission to be human instead of a symbol, which is probably the bravest thing anyone in your position can do. He hesitated, and Sarah could sense him building up to saying something important. I've been thinking about something over these past few days. Watching you work with the families, seeing how naturally you step into situations and make them better just by being present and organized and genuinely caring. It's made me realize that the foundation could really benefit from having someone like you involved in a more permanent way. Not as a celebrity endorser or a figurehead, but as a real partner in the work. He met her eyes. I know that's probably not what you're looking for, and I don't want to pressure you into anything. But I wanted to put it out there that if you were interested in building something together, I would welcome that collaboration. Sarah felt her heart rate pick up. This was an offer of something real, a chance to redirect her energy toward work that mattered, but it was also deeply entangled with the growing connection between her and David that neither of them had directly acknowledged yet. Can I ask you something before I respond to that? She said carefully. What is this that's happening between us? Because I don't think it's just about work, and I don't want to pretend it is. David smiled, and there was a warmth in his expression that made Sarah's breath catch. No, it's not just about work. I think you know that I've been carrying a bit of a torch for you for 15 years, ever since we wrapped that movie and you went back to your world and I went to mine. Seeing you again, getting to witness who you are when all the pretense is stripped away, it's only confirmed what I suspected back then, which is that you're someone extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with fame or beauty or any of the surface things. But, Sarah prompted, because she could hear the unspoken qualification in his voice. But we're both in the middle of major life transitions, David continued. You're figuring out who you are outside of the identity you've been carrying for 2 decades, and I'm rethinking my entire approach to my foundation work. Adding a romantic relationship into that mix could complicate everything, could make it harder for both of us to do the individual work we need to do. He reached over and took her hand. So here's what I'm thinking. You come work with the foundation for 6 months, not as my girlfriend or my romantic interest, just as a partner in the work. We give you space to figure out what this life feels like without the pressure of also navigating a relationship. And at the end of 6 months, if we both still feel this pull toward each other, we revisit the conversation from a place of more clarity. It was perhaps the most mature and thoughtful approach to attraction that Sarah had ever experienced, and it made her want him even more. But she could also see the wisdom in it, the way it would protect both of them from making decisions based on crisis bonding or the intensity of the current moment. 6 months, she repeated. Working together but not together. David nodded. 6 months to see if this is real or if it's just the adrenaline talking. 6 months for you to build a new life and see if this kind of work actually fits you or if you hate it and want to go back to acting. 6 months for both of us to become more whole individually, so that if we do eventually come together, it's from a place of strength rather than need. Sarah thought about it, turning the idea over in her mind. 6 months ago, even 6 days ago, she would have found this approach frustrating, would have wanted immediate gratification and clear definitions. But the person she was becoming understood the value in patience, in doing things slowly and intentionally. Okay, she said finally, 6 months, but I have one condition. David raised an eyebrow. What's that? Sarah smiled. At the end of 6 months, if we both still feel this way, you actually tell me directly rather than proposing another waiting period. I'm willing to be patient, but I'm not willing to be stuck in permanent limbo. David laughed and squeezed her hand. Deal. 6 months of partnership and clarity, and then we have an honest conversation about what comes next. They sealed the agreement with a handshake that turned into a hug that lasted longer than strictly necessary, both of them acknowledging the difficulty of choosing patience when attraction was present and powerful. But as Sarah pulled back and saw the respect and care in David's eyes, she felt more valued than she had in any of her previous relationships that had moved quickly and burned out fast. This was different. This was 2 people choosing to build something sustainable rather than just reacting to chemistry. It felt grown up in a way that matched who she was trying to become. The next morning, Sarah made the calls necessary to formally step back from her acting career, at least temporarily. She talked to her agent about putting out a statement that she was taking a sabbatical to pursue humanitarian work, which would generate some media interest, but would also reframe her narrative from fading star to person making meaningful life choices. She talked to her business manager about restructuring her finances to account for a significant drop in income, since foundation work didn't pay anywhere near what film work did. She talked to her mother, who was predictably worried and confused, but who eventually said she just wanted Sarah to be happy, whatever that looked like. With each conversation, Sarah felt lighter, like she was shedding weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. And the preliminary investigation confirmed that the building collapse had been caused by geological factors rather than design flaws. The foundation board made the decision to rebuild on a different site in the same area, one with more stable ground conditions. The communities were consulted throughout the process, their input shaping every decision, and Sarah got to witness David's approach to development work that centered local voices rather than imposing solutions from outside. She learned about soil testing and earthquake-resistant construction and community engagement models. She sat in meetings with engineers and educators and local leaders, mostly listening at first, but gradually finding her voice and realizing she had valuable perspectives to contribute. The three workers who had been trapped made steady recoveries, and Maria in particular became something of a friend to Sarah, the two women bonding over long conversations while Maria went through physical therapy for her injured leg. "You know what the strangest part is?" Maria told her one day. "Being trapped under all that concrete, thinking I might die, it clarified everything for me. All the petty worries and insecurities and social anxieties just disappeared, and I could see so clearly what actually mattered. My family, my friends, the work I believe in, being kind to people. Everything else was just noise." She looked at Sarah thoughtfully. "David told me you went through something similar, a different kind of collapse that helped you see what mattered. Do you think we need those breaking moments to wake up, or do you think some people figure it out without the crisis?" Sarah thought about it. "I think some people are wise enough to question their path before it becomes a crisis, but I wasn't one of them. I needed everything to fall apart before I could see that the life I was building wasn't actually supporting who I wanted to be." She smiled. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe there's no shame in needing the wake-up call as long as you actually wake up when it comes." Maria nodded. "Well, I'm glad your wake-up call brought you here, even if the circumstances were terrible. You've been really good for David. He smiles more when you're around, and I don't think he even realizes it." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "We're just colleagues, friends." Maria gave her a knowing look. "Sure you are, and that's why he watches you whenever you're in the room, and why you light up whenever he walks in, and why the rest of us have started taking bets on how long you both last with this just friends situation." Sarah laughed despite her embarrassment. "Is it that obvious?" Maria grinned. "Incredibly obvious, but also really sweet. You're both trying so hard to do this the right way, to not rush into anything, and it's making everyone root for you even harder." The 6 months passed more quickly than Sarah had expected, filled with work that challenged her in new ways and friendships that fed parts of her soul that had been starving for years. She learned Spanish, or at least became conversational enough to have basic interactions without a translator. She got her hands dirty, literally, helping with construction projects and school supply distributions and community events. She took that pottery class she had mentioned, finding a local artist in the Guatemalan town where the foundation had its regional office who taught her to center clay on a wheel and build vessels from formless earth. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. She also maintained some connection to her acting work, but on completely different terms. She took a small role in an independent film that shot for 3 weeks in Mexico City, playing a character unlike anyone she had portrayed before, and she found joy in the craft again when it wasn't weighed down by franchise expectations and promotional obligations. She turned down 2 major studio offers without even a moment of regret, recognizing that those paths would pull her back toward a life she no longer wanted. Her publicist worried that she was committing career suicide, but Sarah had made peace with the possibility that she might never work at that level again. If the price of her sanity and sense of purpose was fame, it was a price she was willing to pay. Through all of it, David was a steady presence, a partner in the truest sense. They worked together seamlessly, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made the foundations work stronger. They maintained the boundaries they had set, keeping things professional and platonic, but the connection between them continued to deepen in ways that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with genuine compatibility and shared values. Sarah watched him navigate difficult situations with grace and integrity. He witnessed her growth and transformation with quiet support. They were building something together, multiple somethings, and the anticipation of what might come after their agreed-upon waiting period hummed beneath everything like a quiet promise. As the 6-month mark approached, the foundation held a ceremony to open the rebuilt school, now constructed on geologically sound ground with additional safety features informed by the lessons of the collapse. The community turned out in force, families dressed in their best clothes, children carrying flowers, local leaders giving speeches about education and opportunity and resilience. Maria, James, and Carlos were all there, fully recovered and back at work, their presence a testament to survival and commitment. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd watching David cut the ribbon alongside the village mayor and the eldest community member, and she felt tears spring to her eyes at the beauty of this moment. This triumph wrested from near tragedy. After the ceremony, there was music and dancing, and more food than seemed possible for a small village to produce. Everyone celebrating not just the school, but the collective effort that had made it possible. Sarah danced with children who taught her traditional steps, ate tamales made by Maria's mother who kept hugging her and calling her daughter in Spanish, and felt more connected to community than she ever had at any Hollywood party. As the sun began to set and the celebration started to wind down, David found her sitting on a low wall overlooking the valley, and he settled beside her with a comfortable familiarity born of 6 months of partnership. "So," he said quietly, "tomorrow marks exactly 6 months since that night in the hotel when you showed up at my door." Sarah nodded, her heart rate picking up. "I'm aware." David turned to look at her fully. "I think we should probably have that conversation we agreed to have." Sarah met his eyes, seeing warmth and nervousness and hope reflected back at her. "I think we should." David took a breath. "I'll go first. 6 months ago, I suggested we wait because I wanted to make sure this was real and not just crisis bonding or temporary attraction. And now, after working with you every day, seeing you in 100 different situations, watching you grow into this work and this life, I can say with complete certainty that what I feel for you is absolutely real and has only grown stronger with time and knowledge." Took her hand, and the simple touch sent electricity through Sarah's entire body. "You are brilliant and compassionate and funny and brave, and you make every single thing better just by being part of it. I love how you attack problems, how you connect with people, how you're not afraid to admit when you don't know something. I love your terrible jokes and your surprising competence with power tools and the way you sing off key when you think nobody is listening. I love who you are, Sarah, the real you that exists underneath any performance or persona. And if you feel even a fraction of that toward me, I would very much like to stop being just your colleague and friend and start being your partner in every sense of the word." It was perhaps the most beautiful declaration Sarah had ever heard, made more powerful by its specificity and the 6 months of demonstrated care that backed it up. "I feel considerably more than a fraction of that toward you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think I've been falling for you since that first night when you listened to me fall apart and didn't try to fix me or judge me, just gave me space to be a mess. And every day since then has just confirmed that you are the best person I've ever known. You challenge me to be better while accepting exactly who I am. You make me laugh and make me think and make me want to build a life that matters. So yes, David Chen, I very much want to be your partner in every possible way." They sat for a moment just looking at each other, the weight and joy of the declaration settling around them. Then David smiled, that particular smile that transformed his entire face, and leaned in to kiss her. It was gentle and sweet and held the promise of everything that could come next, and Sarah felt like puzzle pieces were clicking into place, like her whole life had been preparation for this moment, this person, this choice to build something real. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, the sun had fully set and the first stars were appearing in the clear mountain sky. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, echoing the question she had asked 6 months ago in a hotel room in Los Angeles when her whole life was falling apart. But this time she was asking from a place of excitement rather than fear, curious about the future rather than dreading it. David stood and pulled her to her feet, keeping her hand in his. "Now we go back to the guest house and start planning our next project together, both professional and personal. We figure out what it looks like to do this work as a team in every sense. We make mistakes and learn from them and build something sustainable and meaningful. We take it one day at a time and see where it leads." They walked back through the village hand in hand, greeting community members who smiled at them with the knowing looks of people who had seen this coming from miles away. When they reached the guest house, they sat on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings talking, but this time Sarah curled into David's side, his arm around her shoulders, everything finally aligned. "Thank you," she said quietly. David kissed the top of her head. "For what?" Sarah thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, all the collapses, both literal and metaphorical, that had been necessary to clear space for something new. "For being exactly who you are, for waiting, for seeing me, for all of it." They talked late into the night about dreams and plans, about where they might live and what projects they wanted to take on, and whether Sarah would ever act again, and if David might consider returning to it in small doses. They talked about fears and hopes, and the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of building a life with another person. And when they finally went to their separate rooms, because they were still taking things slowly and intentionally even now, Sarah lay in bed feeling more hopeful about her future than she had in years. She thought about the woman who had knocked on a hotel room door 6 months ago, desperate and lost and afraid. That woman would barely recognize who Sarah had become, and that felt like the greatest success of all. The next morning, Sarah woke to find a small clay bowl outside her door, slightly misshapen and clearly handmade, with a note in David's handwriting. "I took your pottery class idea seriously and made this. It's terrible